Hey everyone, and welcome to the Private Podcast, where we plug in and explore the intersection of privacy, human rights, technology, and democracy. I'm your host, Derek E. Silva, and today we are speaking with Julie Owono. Julie is the executive director at Internet Sans Frontières, or for the non-French speaking folks, Internet Without Borders, the inaugural member of the Facebook Oversight Board. Definitely going to dig into that a bit. Practitioner fellow of the Digital Civil Society Lab at Stanford University, as well as an affiliate at Harvard's Berkman Klein Center for Internet and Society. We had Dragana Kaurin on a little while ago, who had also done some work with Berkman Klein. Julie works at the intersection of tech, human rights, and business. She often speaks publicly on issues related to the impact of connectivity on societies. Her writing has appeared in Quartz, Al Jazeera, and others, and she is a regular commentator on international news channels, including France 24, France 24, and BBC World. Julie, thank you so much for taking the time to be here today.
Thank you so much for having me, Derek. It's a great pleasure. And I know a lot of friends have been here, so I'm even more happy to be here.
Terrific. Yes, you sound very busy, so very much appreciate you carving some time out for us. Let's not waste any time. Let's dig right in and find out what is Internet Without Borders.
So it's an organization that works to protect freedom of expression online and as well as privacy online. We initially were created 12 years ago when the junta in Burma had shut down internet for the first, I mean, that was one of the first time we were hearing about internet shutdowns. And then we continued by defending bloggers, journalists who were increasingly imprisoned for what they were writing and the work they were doing through the internet. And yes, now I would say we generally do a lot of campaigns to protect free accessibility to the internet, making sure that everybody can express herself or himself online, and also making sure that people can do it in the way they want to, and particularly in a way that's protective of their private information. So these are some of the things we work on at Internet Without Borders.
That's awesome. Very much in line with Orchid's whole value structure of making sure people have open, free in the sense of Wikipedia is free. You know, like you can actually use the whole thing, access the whole thing, access to the internet, and I guess more or less being able to be yourself without being having to be afraid of what might happen if you say the wrong thing, quote unquote. So that's
Absolutely.
terrific. What led you to join Internet Without Borders?
I was a very young woman at the time, a black woman, a black immigrant woman in a European country, namely France. And at the time, I must say, the prospects for women like me, young girls like me, were quite limited. And then when I discovered this space, which is internet, which allowed me to, first of all, tell my stories to people who had probably would have never met, and afterwards gave me access to places I probably would have never been to. I thought, well, I want to make sure that other black women like me, young black women like me, see this space, see the immense opportunities that this space offers, given the way the infrastructure is set. It's borderless by nature. So I wanted that borderlessness to translate into people's lives, and particularly people who are normally marginalized, who are minorities, or who are harassed or are discriminated against. So I wanted to protect that space and the features that make it so beautiful, and that's why I decided to join Internet Sans Frontières, Internet Without Borders, and continued until I became the director.
That's fantastic. That's a nice story. It's definitely one of the things that attracted me to the internet as a whole early on in the late '90s. Was just meeting hopefully all these cool new people that I simply wouldn't have the opportunity to meet otherwise, and that has led to all sorts of friendships and relationships that I still carry through, and then I'm still forming at. I was in Paris last week at ECC and got to meet all these people that I'd known online and worked with in some capacity, literally meeting them for the first time, even after a year and a half of having a contractual relationship of some kind, including Orchid CEO. So yeah, I definitely get that
Oh,
that
wow.
perspective. So you mentioned a bit, being a young black woman in as an immigrant in France. Maybe with that, and of course some of the more technological or logistical issues. What has been the toughest challenge you've had to face in your industry so far?
I would say the first one, and kind of the most obvious one, is that we tend to be so advanced in seeing the threats and the dangers. And when we talk about those threats and dangers, usually nobody listens to us simply because those threats don't exist at the time when we talk about those. I remember, for instance, when Internet Without Borders filed a lawsuit against Facebook in 2011, I think, with regards to its privacy policy. We were pointing to the risks of having all this information about people being gathered in a single place, and we're wondering about the protection that we're given to all this. I mean, to protect the access to this information. And being European and knowing the history of Europe and knowing the history of particularly um, gathering data, precise data about people. We knew how these data could be misused when put in the wrong
Yeah.
hands. And well, 10 years ago, that was people didn't care, frankly, and some people even laughed at us. But unfortunately, Cambridge Analytica happened, and so many other episodes have happened in between and have proved that yes, we were right. Same thing goes with what we call now content moderation. So the fact that some platforms, and particularly social media platforms, have such power to decide what can be said or not be said on their spaces, but ultimately on the internet, because the reality is that much of the internet now happens on these platforms. Well, when we're talking about those risks and we were alerting about, well, the impact of those tools on more fragile societies where there are not as many safeguards that we would see in the US or in Europe. Well, when we're talking about that, the companies didn't care, but then Myanmar happened with Facebook. So, yes, this is one thing that I would say one of the challenges is being way too advanced and seeing the threats even before they become actual threats.
Everybody wants Nostradamus, and then when Nostradamus comes along, nobody believes them.
Absolutely. That's a great parallel. It's exactly that.
Tell me the future. Yeah, tell me the future. Okay, here's the future. I don't believe you.
I don't want that. I don't believe you, right?
Yeah, I I don't. I'm not a very religious person, but I've often made jokes about how even if the second coming of Christ did in fact happen, nobody would believe him or her
Oh,
because
yeah,
everybody would think they're crazy, right? And that person would literally end up probably in a psychiatric institution. So yeah, it's
absolutely.
it's it
Although,
doesn't often pay to be first.
no, no, no. Although I want to, reassure everyone, nobody in our organization ended up in a psychiatric institution, fortunately. But yes, at the time, nobody was really interested in hearing what we were saying, including governments, by the way, which is interesting.
Yeah, it is, isn't it? Um, so then more practically, how does Internet Without Borders help to fight for digital rights and to fight against digital repression and oppression? You mentioned, I guess, maybe taking a really close eye to privacy policies. Suing Facebook is certainly one way to go about it. What else does IWB do?
So we also do campaigns, advocacy campaigns, for instance, where when a government decides to shut down the internet, we launch campaigns against those shutdowns. So campaigns at several levels, at government level, trying to persuade the government that has disrupted internet, well, why it shouldn't do so. But we also raise awareness within populations beyond the borders of the countries where internet is shut down to make sure people, yeah, can be in solidarity. It helps a lot, and it helps us achieve sometimes the resumption of internet connectivity in some parts of the world. Like you said, we take closer look at privacy policies and we try to highlight what's wrong in those privacy policies. We also try to do something that we don't think happens on the internet but does. There are huge inequalities when it comes to privacy. There are certain parts of the world where, by default, companies will respect the privacy of their users. There's still a lot to be said, but there is a thinking through about what does it mean to protect privacy. And whereas with the same company, there are parts of the world where basically they don't care. We've showed that. We've done research that has proved that some telcos, when they operate in their native market, which are usually located in Europe or at least in northern parts of the world, well, they are very respectful about privacy and they have discussion with their users and consumers about privacy. But when those same companies operate in, let's say, in African countries, sometimes they won't even have policy published, which is completely mind-boggling for anyone
Yeah.
based in the US or in France, for instance. So, yes, we try to highlight those inequalities and try to push companies towards better practices because we truly believe that, especially in the 21st century, a company that positively contributes to the well-being of the society, the well-functioning of this incredible network that we have all contributed, and that we all contribute to build, well, companies that make sure that this space remains healthy, accessible, inclusive, full of opportunities for all, well, those companies are the ones that actually will be profitable. That's truly what we believe in. This is something that we're trying to share as a message.
Yeah. So going back a little bit back to the to a lot of the countries where I guess internet shutdowns happen most, I guess that means you've probably been fairly active in India, Turkey, Nigeria, Myanmar slash Burma, places like
Yes.
that.
Yes, absolutely. We are part of a global coalition that's called the Keep It On Coalition, which was
Yes.
created in 2016 by our friends at the organization Access Now. And yes, through this coalition, we sign open letters to governments every time there is an election, every time there is a demonstration, for instance, because we know these are moments when governments tend to be willing to control the narrative and therefore shut down
Hmm.
either internet or social media platforms. That's more frequent now. And beyond that, we also what we try to do is to show how counterproductive really shutting down the internet is. It makes countries lose money. We were the first
Yeah.
organization, Internet Without Borders, to use some of the methodologies out there to calculate basically how much it costs to a country when you shut down for a week or for three months or more, like we've seen in many places around the world. So
Yeah.
yes, we try increasingly to do that. But one thing that I would like to mention is that increasingly this issue around freedom of expression, access to the network is very closely related to another very important issue, which is harmful content that we tend to see on social media platforms. Like I was saying, increasingly governments focus their censorship on social media platforms. They will block Twitter, like what's happening in Nigeria at the moment. Why do they do that? They their justification is to say we need to protect people from fake news and from hate speech because Twitter and Facebook and all these companies, they're spreading those bad content in our countries. And so to protect ourselves, we had to shut down those platforms. This narrative, which was completely, I would say, hypocritical a few years ago, tends to become m- real. Nevertheless, is being weaponized by regimes to further assert their control on a space that they had lost control or they had never controlled over. So this is a very dangerous moment where we need to pay attention. We need to link the fight against internet shutdowns with a fight for, I would say, better content online or better content moderation, whatever you want to call it. But we can get into more details later.
Cool. And so then what's on the horizon? You obviously you're doing very important advocacy work. We had Burhan Taye from Access Now, and I think she's also with a few other organizations on the show a little while ago. Very important work. What's on the horizon for Internet Without Borders? Is it, more or less just keeping up with what's going on right now, or are you also looking at potentially new initiatives or new ways to help combat and achieve the same mission?
Yes. One thing that I did not mention is that on top of doing advocacy, we also come up with solutions. That's really something we
Mm,
believe in. We think that, like I said, this is a space we all contribute to building and making sure it remains healthy. So we also can come up with solutions that can be helpful. And that's something we want to be focused on doing in the next few years. We want to replace this idea that all the stakeholders on the network have a role to play to save the network. It's not only on the companies to deal with content moderation because they do it very badly, to be honest.
Hmm.
It's not only on the governments. Yes, yes,
We're
that's
gonna get into
very,
that.
yeah. Well, they want to get better, but honestly, they're not doing that very well. Governments also want to get into the business of, deciding what should be on platforms or what shouldn't. That's very dangerous too, because we know
Yes.
how government want to control information as much as possible. So that's why we think that all the solutions that are put out there to allegedly deal with the illnesses of the network must involve all the stakeholders that contribute to that platform. And those stakeholders are civil society organizations like Internet Sans Frontières. There are users. There are also companies, of course. There are governments. So we want to work more on fostering more collaborations between these different actors on every issue that the network is facing, be it content moderation, be it privacy, be it you name it. We really want to foster more multi-stakeholderism and collaborations on internet when it comes to finding solutions to the problems that the network is facing.
Cool. That sounds good. Switching tack a little bit on focusing on community moderation or content moderation. Uh, you're a member of the Facebook Oversight Board. For those who don't know yet, what is the Facebook Oversight Board?
The Facebook Oversight Board is a new body, an independent body that makes binding decision on content moderation decisions made by Facebook and Instagram. So I'll give an example. When Facebook decides to delete your content, for instance, you as a user can appeal to the board to have a review of that decision to delete your content. It's not only content that has been deleted, but also content that is still available. If you, as a Facebook user, you don't like the fact that, well, XYZ account spreads disinformation, for instance, and you see disinformation being available on the platform, well, you can appeal to the board too, and we can take a look into that and decide whether or not Facebook or Instagram should take down the said content. What's interesting is that we make those decisions based on Facebook's community standards, like they call it. These are the rules that you should respect when you're writing and when you're posting on Facebook and Instagram. But beyond that, that's what's particular with the Facebook Oversight Board is that we look at those cases with the lens of international human rights law and standards. It's extremely important to mention this because these are standards and law that have been uh, agreed to by governments something like 70 years ago, including for instance, the Universal Declaration on Human Rights, which says that, well, your freedom of expression is essential, and to limit that freedom of expression, you have to respect well, your government has to respect some rules, including making sure it's written in a law, making sure a judge has been able to say whether or not your freedom of expression should be limited, and so on and so forth. So, what's
Right.
interesting is that we're using this in our lens when we analyze the appeals that are submitted to us. And what's also interesting is that we make binding decisions. So Facebook has to, for instance, reinstate a content when we say put it back up or vice versa, delete it. But we also make recommendations, and those recommendations have proven to be a great force for policy change, basically, at the Facebook level.
Yeah, and I think I'm not sure if it was the first, but certainly the biggest decision to come out of at least a portion of the oversight board, because I know it's not all 50 or 100 people working on every single case all the time. That would be ridiculous. It's like 7 or 9 at a time, something like that. Um, Feel free to give me
Yes,
better, more accurate
well,
numbers if you want,
actually,
but
we're 20 members. I didn't specify. We're 20
okay,
members so far. We will be 40 at the end. And on each case, it's a panel of 5 members that work on the
there you go.
case. Yes. But we have
Okay,
an
I knew it wasn't.
administration. So it could be
Yeah.
9 actually, because we have a lot of people
Okay.
helping us do
Okay.
our work.
All right. Well, either way, I knew it wasn't the whole board because
Yes.
that puts. I don't think any decisions would actually be made. That's just way too many people. 5 makes sense with some admin. Sure, 7 and 9. That's fine. Um,
Exactly.
so I guess the I guess most consequential decision to come out of the Facebook oversight not that long ago was the decision about um, Facebook's temporary but indefinite suspension of uh, the last American president's Facebook account and probably Facebook page as well, or more or less probably the Facebook page as opposed to an actual specific account.
Yes.
And that definitely, that as you mentioned, that actually came, well, A, with the binding decision, and B, with some actual changes. I think the most consequential one there being the fact that Facebook actually had to put a time limit on how long that, up until that point, indefinite suspension would last. And I think it was a year or two.
It's gonna be 2 years. Facebook has announced they're gonna suspend the former president's accounts for 2 years, starting from the moment the decision was made. So that puts us to 2023, I think.
23. Yeah.
Exactly. So it's the biggest decision we've had to make. I can't lie. We received close to 10,000 public comments. So one thing
Wow.
important to mention is that people can contribute to the work that we do. We have public comment periods that open for every case in which people can give us their opinion. Let me know if you heard that. I apologize.
That's okay.
Okay.
That's okay.
Um, so people can contribute. And yes, that was the biggest case, close to 10,000 comments. And we took longer to come to a decision that, you know, we thought was fair. And I think we kind of succeeded, honestly, because what we told Facebook is given this exceptional level of gravity of the situation, well, we thought the company was right to suspend those accounts. We thought the decision was right at the time, but the indefinite aspect of it was not fair because, well, if you have a sanction, you should know whether for how long, basically. And
Right.
so the company hadn't said that, and now they have committed to reassessing in 2 years whether or not it would be okay to have this account back up and running.
Look forward to seeing what happens next.
Yes.
Only because I'm on this side of things and I have no real skin in the game, and I'm not American. I don't get to vote in the U.S. elections. I don't work at Facebook. I'm not on the oversight board. This is really just like get the popcorn out and be like, I wonder what's gonna happen
But
next.
no, it's a very interesting decision because what it has implications beyond just the case of the individual that we're talking about. It has
Sure.
implications for every political figure virtually in the world. Because what we told Facebook, and that's what they also asked us, because they referred the case to us, they said, in general, how do you think we should deal with publications by public figures such as this one, political figures? And what we told the company is that just because you're a public figure does not mean you should, you should you should be allowed to violate the rules when
Right.
other regular users would never get a second pass for an inch of what you would do. So we told them the rules should be the same for all, and at the same time, given the aura, given the yes, the incredible amount of people who follow those public figures, we also think this comes with responsibility, and therefore those accounts should be, yeah, very careful about what they publish because of the impact this can have. And Facebook should pay attention to those publications and should have teams in place to make sure that, well, when there is a problem, this can escalate rapidly even before, things go wrong, basically. So, yeah, that's what we told the company that public figures, political figures, influencers in general, not only political figures, but people who have a lot of audience on social media platforms and particularly politicians who are elected, well, they have a responsibility. They should have the rules applied to them the same way. And most importantly, the company should be transparent about the way it applies its rules to those users. That was not the case
Yeah.
before. So,
Right.
yeah,
Yeah. There was definitely some a lack of clarity on how far things were allowed to go, and then of
absolutely.
course the indefinite suspension and everything else that came after it.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So you work with the Facebook Oversight Board and Internet Without Borders. How do you feel like those two intersect when you're fighting for digital rights and human rights and that sort of thing?
Well, the first of digital rights is freedom of expression, I think.
Hmm.
Once you have the network, what do you do with that? Well, you express yourself, you communicate. So, but this right is increasingly threatened by governments. We've talked about it, but also, willingly or not, by the decisions that companies make on that content or do not make on that content for that matter. Um, so work protecting freedom of expression, you cannot evade questions around content moderation today. That's impossible.
Right.
So the work that I do at the Facebook Oversight Board, which is yes, to make principled decisions that affect freedom of expression, well, content moderation decisions that affect freedom of expression is extremely important because that's the first time in history, virtually, that a body of independent experts will tell a social media company, a private company, well, here is how you should protect freedom of expression when doing business, and here are the way you should make the decisions that you make. When you make a decision, for instance, pay attention to the human rights impact of the decision that you will make. Pay attention to the context. That's what we often tell Facebook and Instagram in our decisions. Pay attention to the process that has led you to make that decision. Was it transparent? Who was consulted? Were the communities affected consulted? So on and so forth. So doing the work that I do at Internet Sans Frontières is very closely linked to the work that I do at the oversight board, because at the oversight board I tell the company what here are some principle here are the principles you should keep in mind when doing policy and when applying your policies on your spaces. And as an activist at Internet Without Borders, I'm still able to tell the companies, well, this is not functioning very well. This content, for instance, is causing trouble in that part of the world. Well, it happens to be a part of the world where you don't invest that much in terms of moderation, human moderation, or even automated moderation. So maybe you should keep a closer eyes on this part of the world. This is what I continue to do at Internet Without Borders, and it's yeah, for me, both are extremely linked. And one of the reasons why I decided to join the Facebook Oversight Board was that I was hoping, and I still do hope, and I know we are able to see dysfunctionings on the platform even before the platform sees it itself, sorry, and can work on it. So yes, long answer just to say yes, those two are very interlinked.
Cool. Last one about things you're working on and maybe how they impact each other. What about the global partnership for AI? We haven't talked much
Oh,
about it, but could you
yes.
give a very brief overview and maybe where you see that work also intersecting or aligning with the work you're doing already as a Facebook Oversight Board member or Internet Sans Frontières?
Yes. So global partnership on AI, sorry, was is gathering a group, a network of experts gathered to work on ethical principles that can be applied to artificial intelligence. And it's very relevant to the work that I do elsewhere, and particularly at Internet Sans Frontières and the Facebook Oversight Board, because increasingly moderation is being automated, so it's a machine making the decisions. Um, and we also know that those machines tend to have certain biases, tend to see certain things, tend to not see other things. And we, at the GPI, as we call it, the Global Partnership in AI, we try to reflect on, yes, what are the principles that should be kept in mind by every creator of um, algorithms, by every government that will decide to deploy AI powered public services, because that's also a big conversation at the moment, digitizing our public lives, our citizens' lives.
Right.
Yeah, it's the responsibility of governments making sure that the necessary safeguards are in place especially when it comes to protecting our privacy, our free expression, our right to non-discrimination, and all the other very important human rights that should be protected.
Terrific. I think that's a fairly new organization, only about a year or so old, started
Yes,
by the French and the Canadians,
yes,
but with
governments.
many other countries involved. So I'm looking forward to seeing what sort of I guess recommendations, policy recommendations probably, and that sort of thing comes out of GPI, as you called it. Terrific. Yeah, you mentioned this earlier with, I guess, Nigeria, the government of Nigeria and Twitter being at loggerheads. What's the status of digital rights in Nigeria, especially around the government's ban of Twitter, and and
Yes.
if anything that you haven't already mentioned, what's IWB trying to impact on that issue, or how are they involved there?
Yes. So the status of digital rights in Nigeria are currently a matter of preoccupation for many activists in this space, in the digital rights space, because, well, like I said, the government decided to shut down access to Twitter. Well, what happened, and it's very interesting to remember the sequence of events that led to that censorship. Twitter decided to delete a publication by the Nigerian president, Muhammadu Buhari, who was allegedly, I haven't seen the publication, but allegedly was threatening armed independent, huh? Well, people who are in favor of their independence, of the Biafra independence particularly, who have been accused by the government of causing terror attacks in the southern parts of Nigeria. Well,
Mm-hmm.
these groups had been allegedly threatened by the government, by Buhari administration and the president himself of retaliation. And Twitter considered this as a call for violence, which is forbidden on the platform, and decided to
Right.
delete the publication. In retaliation of that, the government said, well, the platform is causing a lot of, well, people are sharing harmful content, and Facebook and Twitter, sorry, is doing nothing. So we're indefinitely suspending access to Twitter. Here, indefinitely is extremely interesting because if you remember, that's exactly what Twitter, Facebook, and all these told President Trump when he was banned from Twitter and to YouTube and all of these platforms.
Right.
And President Trump was actually one of the first to congratulate, if not the only one, to congratulate President Muhammadu Buhari on his move. So I'm
Mm.
reminding us of this sequence of events to show how interlinked the fight against internet shutdowns is increasingly becoming with the fight against harmful content online and particularly content moderation. I think what this episode tells is, on the one hand, companies increasingly need to be transparent. They need to explain why do you delete this, why you don't delete this. These are extremely important decisions that affect nations, as you can see in this case. So there should be explanations. On the other hand, governments should be aware that censorship is absolutely not the way to go. For instance, the Nigerian government have banned Twitter, but people continue using it. They use VPNs. And they were
Yeah.
one of the trending topics after the ban was a trending topic from Nigeria on Twitter. So yeah, not that efficient.
It's the
But
Barbara Streisand effect. I'm
exactly,
I'm gonna sue you, sue the paparazzi, and stop you from ever taking a photo of my house ever again. And then what happens?
the how
Lots of pictures from Barbara Streisand's house.
exactly,
They could take it by other people, or what, or like by helicopter. Yeah,
exactly.
that's a very old reference, but like,
Absolutely, but one that
yeah,
unfortunately the Nigerian authorities probably missed. But it's we hope to have an opportunity to update them because you were asking what Internet Without Borders is doing on this. Well, we are organizing the first ever multi-stakeholder conversation on content moderation in Nigeria, but more largely in West Africa or in Africa in general. Because when we talk about content moderation, we don't talk about that part of the world where there are lots of things happening with regards to content moderation. You mentioned Ethiopia earlier. Right now, Ethiopia is there is a conflict, a very severe conflict ongoing, and potentially an
yeah,
ethnic conflict. And a lot of activists on the ground had been warning social media platforms about the content that were freely flowing on these platforms before the conflict became very open and became a civil war. So, yes, there is a lot of question with regards to why content moderation is not a priority when it comes to African continent and African countries particularly. So yes, we're organizing this conversation first of all to let the authorities know that about the Barbara-Streisand effect, among other things, but also to make sure that users in Nigeria have knowledge or at least have an access to policy teams at Twitter, to Facebook teams, to any other social media teams, because that's something that's lacking. When you're a user or let's say you're an activist, a female activist, feminist activist in West Africa, if today you're facing harassment, you have nowhere to turn to, especially on platforms. And that's a problem. Um, so yes, we are organizing this roundtable to have this necessary conversation on content moderation and also make sure that yes, the network is in place, that if I'm a user, I know where I can turn to. I know what organization can help me. And I also know that at the platform level, something can be done. And there are teams working on that, trust and safety teams particularly.
Just maybe trying to think about like at least one of the underlying causes. Do you think it's just that Twitter, Facebook, um, Instagram, etc., maybe LinkedIn to a certain extent, but that's more professionally oriented. Do you think they just see Africa as less of a economic opportunity and therefore they're not investing those same resources, or do you think there's maybe something else in addition to that, or something else entirely going on?
I think there are lots of paradoxes here. Um, on the one hand, yes, indeed, many of the Silicon Valley companies tend to believe that, from a market perspective, the African continent is not interesting as of yet. I'm adding as of yet because we also know that many of these companies, Facebook and Google being the main ones, are investing a lot to connect the unconnected. They're investing in internet infrastructure. There's a big cable built by Facebook with a consortium of telecommunications operators, I think, and also the same for Google. So while for now, yes, probably from a market perspective, these countries are not that interesting. We also know that the next billion of internet users will be located in Africa, Latin America, and in South Asia, Southeast Asia. So um, this is very paradoxical. But what I'm telling those companies all the time is actually it can be very interesting from a market perspective to invest more in content moderation because first of all, you will see the type of trend that might come back and backlash in US or in Europe later on because we're talking about countries where there is absolutely no regulation. So a lot of
Mm-hmm.
bad things that we're seeing tend to happen there first because you can do testing, there's no regulation. The population, the connected population is still more or less limited depending on the country you're talking about. So it's very easy to try things. Um, that's what we try to tell them. And even beyond that, what we tell them is, okay, if you envision to tap into this potential in 10, 20 years, well, you probably won't be able to do that because in the very present, your products are being banned. Twitter banned, for instance, they're being
Yeah.
banned. And at the same time, those same governments are exploring what other possibilities are out there. We learned that, for instance, the Nigerian government has consulted with Chinese regulators about the Chinese firewall and how it could be implemented in Nigeria as well. That's that's the
Oh my gosh.
case more or less everywhere. I mean, in a lot of places on the African continent at the moment. So, yes, basically what we're telling is it might not be interesting from a market perspective as of today, but it's a big risk for the future. So it's probably better to invest now and pay more attention to what's happening there than being sorry in 10 years, maybe.
I would tend to agree, but I don't work at Twitter or Facebook or
No,
Google or anywhere else that where I could have a direct impact internally.
absolutely.
I don't have a TikTok account. I'm going to preface the this next question with that statement. No desire to use it either, but I know it's incredibly popular. It's becoming even more popular. What are your thoughts on this trend of Black Lives Matter being flagged as inappropriate content? Meanwhile, white supremacy, anti-Semitic sentiments apparently are acceptable phrases
Mm.
on TikTok.
As a Black activist myself, this is extremely shocking, obviously, and should be shocking to anyone, and it is. I've read a lot of reactions to that. But immediately, the first question as a content moderation activist too is why? Why?
Hmm.
I mean, maybe TikTok should explain why Black Lives Matter is not acceptable and white supremacism is. There must be a reason for that, but they should explain. And that goes back to the necessity of being transparent for social media platforms such as TikTok, which are very popular, but which are also, I mean, if there were no users, if there were no Black influencers on TikTok in the first place, that platform
Yeah.
probably wouldn't look the same. We've all read about the Black creators strike a few weeks ago that deeply affected the platform. So
Hmm.
yes,
Hmm.
maybe the company owe its users and everyone, the society, an explanation as to what is happening. Why is it that? There must be certainly a reason, I'm sure, but they ought to give explanations to people. That's the first thing. And the second thing is that speaks to the importance of the multi-stakeholderism that I was talking about. Because I'm sure if you look at the teams at TikTok, well, chances are there are not many Black people, not many Black women, even less.
Yeah.
So, yeah, that sociology is important. And it's even more important to be open to that multi-stakeholderism I was talking about because who are the ones who surface this problem? It's not TikTok developers. It's TikTok users who
Yeah.
surfaced that there was a problem. So yes, I would say my first reaction is of course shock, but then why? Explain to us what is happening, how you're going to repair this if that's an injustice. I believe it is, but maybe there is an objective reason. I tend to be open. I'm always listening. But then, yeah,
I'm having a hard time imagining what I guess
hey,
what part of where I start to think is this a is this a ByteDance Douyin originated issue? So it's actually started at the Chinese parent company, or is this specifically the American TikTok only, formerly called Musically version? Like only TikTok has this issue, or did this start at
at the
Douyin? I'm pretty sure is the parent company, and ByteDance, the
like that.
actual original version of the TikTok app. I have a feeling it goes back to the Chinese origination, and in that sense, this sort of thing slipping through might make a little bit more sense. It's still not okay. It still
Yes,
needs to be fixed, in my
yes,
opinion.
yes,
But at least that would have a way more cultural, historical understanding of why this happened.
yes. No, I agree.
But
Yeah,
if it started in Santa Barbara, California, or wherever TikTok is based now, that's a whole other kettle of fish.
absolutely.
and
Uh,
and it would actually be worse, I think, just given like I said,
the
historical
U.S.
circumstances.
background.
That would be
Yes,
much worse if it started specifically at TikTok. Like regardless, and we've talked before on the show about how most machine learning models and that those things turn into algorithms. They get applied at this sort of level, have a very white male bias.
absolutely.
Um, it's better than it was, but again, that could help explain how it happened. But the fact that it got through to production,
Yes,
and then that a black individual probably identified it as a problem is still
mind-boggling.
it's really bad.
2021.
Yeah,
Yes, I
yeah, yeah.
completely agree, and that's why transparency is extremely important here, and probably internal investigation to be published. I remember that Facebook did an investigation of its own ad dysfunctions that allowed racist advertisement and racist targeting for advertisement.
Mm,
I think TikTok would truly benefit from being transparent also in a thorough investigation of what happened and also a suggestions for the way forward, what they're going to do to fix this, because that's what's most interesting. So far, I haven't heard anything from the company. Hopefully, that will change very soon. But yes, this is another, yeah, testament to why it's important to be transparent in this industry more than ever.
yeah, and I know. machine learning, the actual models or the actual algorithm, those are really hard to explain. But it's not hard to explain the inputs. What are the inputs going into the training? Like if it's a bunch of phrases that only white people say, um, then yeah, I understand how we got here then.
Yes,
Um, but yeah, but then if that's the case, well, then obviously you need to change your
your
training
algorithm.
data
Absolutely.
yeah, you need to change the data that's getting fed in.
Absolutely.
All right, we are coming up to time here, but I do want
Really?
to ask you. We are. I know
It's so
it's
fast.
45 minutes have just flown by.
Right.
Hopefully everybody listening feels the same way. I wanted to get your thoughts on protecting your privacy online. You don't have to go into like specific details of like here's my Finsta or here's my fake Reddit account. I'm just curious about like when you, especially when you're doing internet without borders work, like
Yeah.
what sorts of processes or tools are you implementing to protect yourself? You touched on VPNs earlier.
Yes.
Are there other things you do to help protect you? You got a separate mobile phone that you take with you overseas or whatever.
Oh my God. I
Which
wish
I kind of do. I kind of don't. I took an Android phone with me to France, but there was a whole other separate set of reasons.
I wish I were that, you know, um, organized, but no, I don't have a separate phone. But instead, I will separate the company, I mean, the organization and my personal level. At the organization level, we're
Sure.
extremely conscious about, and we've been very since almost forever, about encryption and the importance of making sure that your communications can be protected from outside eavesdropping. So
Yeah.
we push all our staff to use certain platforms, messaging platforms, compared to others. Well, Signal, particularly, we are big fans of Signal. Um,
Yeah.
we also train our new staff on using Thunderbird and using GPG and all these encryption suits that are open source and can be
Yeah.
available for anyone. What I would like to say is that it was very difficult to do that 10 years ago because the tools were extremely not user friendly. Let's be honest, but there's been
Yeah.
a lot of progress, especially after, in the wake of the Snowden revelations and the opening it was really for humanity to realize the kind of trouble we were in with regards to privacy and against surveillance. So these are two of the major aspects we pay a lot of attention to. Also, what we try to tell our coworkers is, well, using all the add-ons that would allow them to be protected from tracing online. So do not track sorry, protect them from tracking. Do not track, for instance. Our
Yeah.
websites has almost zero cookies. We don't have like widgets. We've deliberately chosen not to have any widgets with social media because you're here for information. You're not here to be tracked by Facebook and all this. So yes, we are really conscious of that, and we try to apply ourselves the same principles that we tell others to apply. And from my personal perspective, yes, I would say I have a for my camera.
Webcam cover. Yeah.
Yes, a webcam cover. I also well, when I want to do sensitive search, I don't use Google. I use DuckDuckGo mostly, but you know, um, other search engines that are privacy friendly. And I try to be very curious all the time. What are we use a lot internally for our pads, and we use Framapads, we use Framadate, we use Framacalc, which are open source suits for
Oh, okay.
calc, spreadsheets, pads, and so on and so forth. Even Doodle, you can do Doodle with that, but it's privacy friendly. So yeah, we try to
Yeah.
support as much as open source and as possible. And in the event of censorship events, you mentioned VPN. We are extremely I mean, we're extremely conscious of the importance of advocating for VPNs, especially in parts of the world where internet is shut down. But one thing we really want to, and I take this opportunity of being on private podcast of urging VPN makers to really think about how data is expensive in a lot of parts of the world, and using a VPN should not add burden to that cost. So we're really
Right.
urging those who think through to think about that when they, put their products available, especially in those parts of the world. So yeah,
Well, I heard about this really great crypto powered VPN called Orchid that's like it's all pay as you go, and
yeah.
and an in-app purchase only costs $1 to get going. I just they're just getting going. We'll see what happens with
No,
them next.
I really love it too, and we should, I don't know, partner to make sure to, advocate more about this tool. We do that a lot. We partner with VPN makers, but also circumvention Tor, for instance, circumvention tools, but
Hmm.
also censorship measurement communities. I'm thinking, for instance, about the Open Observatory of Network Interference, UNI, which is a great tool to measure when there is a problem with your network. And yes, we do a lot of training to people about these tools and also about privacy, especially to activists, to journalists in places of the world where it's difficult to have such professions. So
Yeah.
yes, I would love to continue the conversation with Orchid, but other than that, I'm really happy I could pass on this message here today. Thanks for that.
Terrific. I'll get you in touch with the right people. We don't need to harp
Awesome.
on that. Terrific. Julie, thanks so much for your time today. This was wonderful. I hope everybody listening learned something as well. We've definitely covered some new ground here with TikTok and the Facebook privacy, the Facebook
Oversight.
oversight board, and things like that. So thank you very much for your time and your expertise. And until next time, I will say stay free.